Hello, everyone. We're going to let people continue to come in. We'll start here in about 30 or so seconds. All right. Welcome, everyone, to this office hours. Today's topic is on the legal preparation for your search to buy business. My name is Will Smith, and I'm the host of the podcast Acquiring Minds. Attorneys James David Williams and Bill Barlow are going to host this session. Bill and James David are probably already known to many of you. They're partners in Barlow and Williams, a practice specializing in small business acquisition. So they see tons of deals. They're really at the front lines of our market, and their focus is, of course, helping searchers, sponsors like you all execute your deals while protecting your downside. They also represent sellers, so they understand well both sides of the table. This is their 7th office hours with Acquiring Minds. Thank you, guys. And I encourage everybody in the audience to go back and watch their other sessions if you didn't attend those. All of them are, all 6 of those, and then today's always available on the Acquiring Minds website, the recording. I'm going to provide direct links to each of those 6 here in the comments in a minute. A couple quick housekeeping items. The way we do this is that Bill and James David give their presentation on the legal aspects of setting up your search. They're going to go over the LOI template that they have for all of you, and then we'll do Q&A. To ask a question, use the Q&A function of Zoom. So not chat, which should be disabled, and not the raise your hand, which I always see. It's the Q&A button that you're looking for. Also, sometimes an audience member's question will be very specific to their deal, very in the weeds, and it's difficult to answer something like that publicly, to digest it and answer it publicly. So we tend to favor questions that are more broad in appeal. That said, if you do have such a detailed question, feel free to ask it. And if we don't choose it, James David and Bill can follow up with you privately, directly after the webinar to answer it. Just make sure if you're logged in anonymously that you also put an email address or some way they can contact you to answer the question. As always, sessions being recorded, as I already touched on, and we're going to email everybody who registered, all of you and those who couldn't attend, a link to the recording and the slides and the LOI template in the next day or 2. And finally, those links to all of James David and Bill's previous 6 sessions there in the chat, and plus their socials and website and emails. Scroll to the top of that monster comment I just put in there, and connect with Bill and James David on LinkedIn. That's it, guys. Over to you.
All right, thank you, Will. And I will say, we do answer all of the questions in email. I've responded to a few people who are surprised to actually get an answer. I do actually answer all of them. So go ahead and send those questions. Make sure you put an email address so I can contact you. As Will said, we are Barlow and Williams. We are an M&A law firm. It is at this point all that we do. We specialize in these transactions for searchers, sponsors, and we also represent sellers, as Will said, which gives us a variety of perspectives that we feel helps us with all of our clients. One of the unique things about our law firm is that we operate on flat fees. So if you do decide to work with us on your transaction before you ever start with us, you will know exactly what your all-in legal costs are and when those fees will be due. So I just like to point that out because that is not something that every law firm does. I'll hand it over to Bill now to start the presentation, and I will share my screen to allow that.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for coming. So our presentation is going to be put into two parts. The first part is going to be talking about the common questions that we get asked all the time from people that are starting their search. And then the second part will be going through the LOI template that we're going to give to each of you at the end of this. So I'm going to start with some common questions that we get from searchers all the time. And I'm going to preface this by saying this applies to all types of searchers. So if you're doing a self-funded search, a traditional search, if you're looking to do an independent sponsor acquisition, this all applies. But the answers are sometimes a little different depending on the type of search that you're doing. So we can go to the first slide there. One of the questions we often get asked is about setting up a legal entity. A lot of people will come to us and ask, do I need to set up a legal entity right away? How do I do it? All of these sort of questions. So if you are doing a self-funded search, then you don't really need to set up a legal entity right away. It's okay if you do, it's fine, but it's not required to really start the search process. There are some advantages to doing it. Some people make it feel more official when they're coming across. It can sometimes help with a little bit of accounting stuff if you're expensing things that way, but it's not really necessary. If you're doing a traditional search where you're taking money in from investors before going out and making the acquisition, you're going to have to set up a legal entity so that you can form those contracts. And if you're doing an independent sponsor transaction, those tend to be a little bit larger than the SBA deals. We find that those people typically do set up legal entities at the beginning of their search. A few things just to note, more common questions around setting up a legal entity. A lot of people ask, well, what type of legal entity do I set up? The answer is almost always a LLC, which stands for Limited Liability Company. That there are certain situations, certain rare situations where people might want to set up a C corporation, but talk to an attorney before doing that. There's a lot of information online about things called QSBS and potentially getting a tax-free exit, but it's more complicated than online stuff will have you know. So, just keep in mind, LLC is probably a good default. And then another point that I'd like to make on this is a question that often comes up is where I should form an entity. And to that, I would say, if you are planning on taking on outside investors, especially if you're a traditional search fund or you're looking to do an independent sponsor style acquisition, then it's most common just to do it in Delaware. That's sort of the standard location for entities. If you're doing a self-funded search, you can do Delaware, but you also, if you know the state where you're going to be doing the acquisition, and that's where you're located, it's often a perfectly fine idea and sometimes will save you on some costs too, if you just set up the entity in that state where you're located and you know your search is going to be. And by the way, any questions on this, feel free to interrupt. So,
Bill, I have a couple questions here. So self-funded search, when I do form an entity, that also will be the entity, not just the vehicle that I perform my search in, but it'll also be the receptacle for the business that I buy. So I'm forming the entity that will also be the go forward business entity into my ownership.
Generally speaking, yes. It's not the end of the world if you end up forming a different entity to do the actual acquisition. Sometimes people will do that because they want the new entity to have a name similar to the target, and obviously you don't know that at the beginning of your search. So yes, but don't stress too much about it because you can always form a new entity. It costs a couple $100, which is sad, but it's not the end of the world.
And so if you guys, your position is that forming it for a self-funded search or forming an entity to start the search is not necessary, then at what point is the trigger to form the entity?
So you will certainly need to do it before the acquisition is complete. And sometimes lenders will like you to have it formed a little bit early. We've seen people form it even a week or two before closing. So, it's if you're using your own money and not anything else, you can often wait quite a while. Lenders will sometimes want you to do it a little bit beforehand. So usually I'd say once you're done with QOE and you know that this is going forward, there's no reason to delay at that point to form it.
So it sounds kind of like you can kind of be prompted by circumstances. It's like when you hit something where it's like somebody tells you, some stakeholders, one of your vendors is like, we need a legal entity. Okay, then that's when you need to know to do it. But you kind of otherwise can kind of keep waiting.
Yeah, that's correct, Will. What we don't want is for setting up the legal entity to become a stumbling block, right? I've talked to several people who don't want to start the search until they set up the legal entity and they do all this research around the legal entity and what it should be. Is just we encourage you to skip that, right? Move on to the important things and set up the legal entity when you need to.
Great. And when I do, you said it's just a couple $100, few $100. Any entrepreneur will have seen lots of ads targeted at them online about just set up your LLC. Are these online kind of point and click your way to an LLC things or to a corporate entity? I mean, I guess those services steal business from attorneys like you guys, so maybe you don't love them, but are they basically fine? Kind of these off the shelf legal entity solutions?
Yeah, no, we often will have our clients use one of them. I'm not going to name any for purposes of, no free ads, but we will often have our clients use those services. And why we do that is we want the client to have the registered agent account moving forward to manage the ongoing filings. So it's actually easier if the client does it and we don't, but we still walk people through that process.
Oh.
And a couple words to the wise on when you use those third-party services, they'll often sort of have like upgraded gold, platinum plans, whatever it is. You really just need the very basic. You just need to get the entity formed. You don't need a business plan or licenses or operating agreement, and none of that stuff is truly necessary. They will sometimes also offer to get you an EIN for like an extra $50. You can get that yourself on the IRS's website in like 15 minutes. So, obviously everybody's has different comfort levels, but do that. And the other thing I would keep in mind is that a lot of times these services make their money with their annual registered agent fees. And so some services will charge you like quite a lot for those annual fees. So when you're deciding which service to use, just make sure you're checking on that if you're using them as a registered agent, because that can get a little bit more expensive. Also,
Right.
if one of the benefits, by the way, if you set up in your own, like, let's say you're searching in the state where you live, you can be your own registered agent. So you don't have to, deal with all that stuff. So.
We got a bunch of questions just about state. It's always the question, should I do Delaware or not? But there are other supposedly advantageous states, Wyoming, Nevada, which I'm seeing mentioned here in the questions. Just maybe another minute on thinking that through, or what people should consider there.
Yeah, I mean, similar things. Nevada and Wyoming are sort of like the cheaper versions of Delaware, and honestly, that's probably fine. Some investors, especially if you're raising traditional equity and going through that process, they just feel slightly more comfortable with Delaware since they see it all the time. And so, how much extra is it worth it to potentially raise a question? I don't know. So the answer is that they're all good options, and depending on what you're looking for, it's hard to go wrong. The only time where I would say be a little careful is there's a couple jurisdictions where it's kind of a headache, like in New York, where I'm barred. You have to publish in a physical newspaper in order to set up an LLC. Like it's an arduous process. So, there can occasionally be a state where you prefer not to incorporate, but in general, it's fine.
Thank you.
All right. So the next part that we want to go to, so now you've set up your LLC or not. Both are good options, depending on your needs. The next thing that you'll typically encounter in your search process is what's called an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. So before you get confidential information about a potential target company, you're often asked to sign an NDA. And some people, this is the first real legal document you're signing with a counterparty. You can, get concerned. I will say that, and this is a little, scary for me to say as a lawyer, but 99% of the time, it's totally fine to sign the NDAs and just kind of click through and go through. So I wouldn't be too worried about feeling like you need to get legal counsel or anything like that for any of these NDAs. The only two things I'd say is, one, if they're asking you for any sort of money for signing an NDA, that's a red flag. That should never happen. And number two is if you are doing strategic acquisition, so you're doing like a roll-up, then the NDA becomes a little more important, because sometimes they could say, oh, you took this idea from me, or whatever it is. So if you are doing a roll-up strategy, know that the NDA becomes, you have to be more careful about that process. So that basically covers that. The next question that we often get asked is, let's say you've gone through, you found a target you're excited about. The broker who, let's say you're going through, a broker comes back to you and says, hey, like, I have this LOI form that you should use to make an offer. This is the form our brokerage always uses. If you want to send an offer, use this form. This is an area where you should not sign anything that's been prepared by a broker without consulting an attorney first, or at least looking through and reading very carefully, because a couple things we often see is, number one, unrefundable deposits. So if they sign the LOI, even if the seller has a bunch of things wrong with it, you're just out, a couple $1,000s or whatever it is. We have seen instances where the LOI is actually a full purchase agreement. So it's you are being bound to do this acquisition. And that's why you have to be careful. It's not to say we've done deals where we've worked with an LOI form that the broker has used, like it's not impossible, but you do have to be careful, because you could get yourself into, a bad situation if you sign the wrong document.
Bill, a couple of questions here about your caveat on NDAs if you intend to do a roll-up or are in the middle of a roll-up. What is the language that you need to be careful of there? If you, especially also somebody points out, like, okay, maybe I'm not doing a roll-up today, but in 3 years, I might want to acquire another business in my industry. So how to think about not, signing on something where you can be accused of violating the NDA.
Right. So usually it gets to the definition of what is counted as confidential information. So a written NDA will carve out information that was publicly available or already known by the recipient prior to them signing the NDA and going through this process. So you don't want a situation where you see something in the data room, you're already aware of like the main suppliers in the business, right, or whatever, and then they say, oh, you used this supplier or did something in your business, and you're like, I already knew about that, right? Again, not super common, especially at the smaller level, because it's not as common for you to be directly competitors, but just that's usually where you have to be careful. On some bigger deals in private equity, sometimes they will also have sort of limitations about like what you can do. On occasion, I've seen something where they've tried to sneak in some type of non-compete. So, again, not appropriate, shouldn't happen, but that's just something you can just be aware of.
Great. And say I have investors and I want to talk about a deal with them. Are they covered under the NDA? Am I violating the NDA? How do I think about that?
It's funny because back in my Wall Street days, this was probably the most negotiated part of NDAs is the coverage for investors and third-party representatives. Um, you know, at the level of deals that we're talking about here, you can basically assume that, when you sign it, as long as if an investor is actually another strategic partner who might actually use this information for something, then you should be a little bit more careful and back and forth. But if investors are truly just third parties that don't have any strategic involvement, honestly, there's not that much risk. They probably aren't asking for that access anyway. If you want to confirm that, though, there's a definition of representatives where sometimes you'll include potential investors in that deal. So if you feel nervous about it at all, talk to your lawyer and also include in the carve out that you can give it to investors. So
this is tricky because you're at this stage in your search, you're looking at a lot of different SIM. You're asking for a lot of different SIMs and and already the NDAs that we get from brokers and sellers are never use DocuSign. They never make it easy. They're always messy and gross. And so there's already a lot of friction there. And so if you then introduce more, if you try to over-engineer the NDA, there's that much more friction. And a seller who's already kind of worried about tire kickers and somebody taking up their time is unlikely to want to negotiate the NDA of all things. So I think that maybe that should be called out to say that, like, this, as with all legal documents, you got to pick your battles. And so this is a tricky one because at the same time, these are great questions by the audience. You don't want to just be able to think that if you're talking to an investor about a deal you're looking at, that you're violating the NDA. So, I don't know.
Yeah. And something I'd also say is that, the reality is that SIMs are passed around like popcorn. So, that is something that, I would feel relatively comfortable just sharing that going through the process. If for whatever reason you have an investor that's asking for like customer information or something that could be a little bit more confidential, first of all, why? But, then you might take a look. But you shouldn't get hung up about sending a SIM around, which is a confidential information memorandum, and ask for a change to the NDA. As you said, Will, that's just going to get a seller upset. So
yeah, great, thanks.
The next point, which in some respects might be the most important question we talk about, is when should I talk to a lawyer? So first of all, it's always fine to talk to a lawyer at the beginning of the process, just to sort of, talk to several lawyers, kind of get the feel of different ones you might want to work with. That's always fine. But in terms of actually engaging with a lawyer, hiring one, starting to pay one, when does that typically happen? And we find that happens once not every single time you send out an LOI, although maybe the first time you talk to a lawyer just to get comfortable with it. But usually after you've sent an LOI to the seller, giving you feedback that you are, kind of their top choice, and you're finalizing that. So that's usually the best time to re-engage the lawyer and say, hey, I'm looking to finalize this. Let's kind of work on this deal. Oftentimes what happens is you end up signing an LOI and then you engage a lawyer. That's perfectly fine too. I would say don't wait until after QOE to engage a lawyer. Some people will say, well, wait until then because, you don't want to rack up legal fees. That's true to the extent that you don't want your lawyer doing a lot of work before the QOV. But there are a couple things that a lawyer can do at the front end, which sometimes you need to get questions answered before you even do a QOE. And so, that's why you usually engage a lawyer before you do the QOE so that you don't accidentally trip up, something that would kill the deal or cause you to retrade the deal. So that's generally what we say in terms of timing, as far as that's concerned.
And I'll just add that we structure our fees deliberately to account for that timeline. So we have built this into our process as far as staggering the workflows as the process goes along. So we encourage people to talk to us early, right? If you come to us with a signed LOI, it's possible, happy to have the conversation, but it is possible that we'll have to change a few things, and that may be to your detriment. So
yeah, and I will say tons of people come to us with a signed LOI, and that's fantastic. And so definitely don't feel shy if that's the position you're in to reach out. But if you do wait until then to talk to an attorney, sometimes they'll flag things like, oh, you put in a term that's not going to work with the SBA, and you might need to just retrade that before you, get to the finish line. So.
Guys, when shopping attorneys, what's more important, kind of SMB horizontal experience or industry vertical experience?
I would say most of the time it's more important to have SMB horizontal experience, because if you're doing a lot of deals that are bigger in that industry, honestly, you're often going to get a lawyer that's going to cost you a lot more than will work. There are exceptions. So if you want to, for instance, buy a practice that does healthcare providers, and you need regulatory stuff, then you need somebody that is in that vertical. It's always nice to have, but I'll just speak from our own experience. We have experience on a wide variety of verticals, and we find that is helpful. And if you have, unless it's a highly regulated niche, don't feel like, oh, this person, did an engineering firm deal and a construction guy deal, but hasn't done a restoration deal yet. Like, you're probably getting a little bit in the weeds if you do that.
Okay.
Great. The next thing we would say is, because, and we're about to jump to the LOI section of it, but one of the biggest things that you'll be doing in terms of legal documents is drafting your letter of intent. And so the question is, how do you go about the process of doing that? I will say there are a number of templates online. I would encourage you to use a template that's from a law firm that does this all the time. Obviously, we're about to give you our template, so we'd love you to use that. But regardless, if you just Google it, you'll see quite a few templates. And some of the templates that are from non-law firms are not really the best. And so I would just encourage you to use one from a law firm. And we'll go into that in just a moment. All right.
I have to switch my screen share.
So now, by the way, we're going to be basically using our LOI template. We're going to hopefully help you see how an LOI, would be drafted.
Okay, I think I've got my screen set up. Hopefully that's working.
There will be a link to this in the email that we send out with the recording, everybody. I'm sure we'll get that question here in a minute. So everyone will get a link to this document.
And I'm sure we'll still get the question anyway, but that's okay. And don't try to read everything as we go. I'm going to deliberately move probably too quickly to allow that. So the first section of it, our pretty logo, and then some instructions, right? So we're lawyers, we're not artists, so we're going to use two different color formats, two different color highlights in this document. Items in yellow will be filled out. That'll be names and numbers largely, and then footnotes will be highlighted in green, and those are places that are where there may be more general structural changes. I will say at the outset that we, at this point, are only producing a single LOI template to be used regardless of the transaction structure. It may be that we change that in the future, but for now, we're just doing one template, and that's why, right, certain things are different if it's an asset deal versus a stock deal, or if there's seller rollover, for example. And again, you'll fill in all the yellow, all the green, you'll delete all the highlights, this cover page. There's a bunch of brackets and footnotes, and delete all of that before you send it to the seller. And then some nice legal disclaimers. That way, you know, we are actually a law firm. So we put all of the legal boilerplate about you're not our client until you're actually our client, and all those things. So we'll just walk through it. And I promise, like you see that it's 8 pages here. It will not be 8 pages by the time you actually finish it, right? We don't want overkill with the LOI. We want there to be enough there, but we don't want overkill. So you'll see, right, it is a letter, so we'll do it properly with the date and the name and address, and we'll address them as they go, and then we'll fill in, and we talked about, so for example, buyer name. All right, so if you haven't set up your entity yet, you can put your individual name, and that's okay, and understand that, and you could put, or an affiliate of my name, right? Don't get hung up on that, right? It's okay if you don't have the entity set up yet. Most people don't. Then we'll just do that. And then there's 2 footnotes here, right? So if this is written on the basic level, this is an asset deal, is what this LOI template is, because that is often the default in the SMB world. But if it's a stock sale, then we go down to note number 1, and we'll make the following changes, right? There's a few changes to different sections just to change the wording to make it work right. And if there's a seller equity role, same thing, right? The structure just going to look a little bit different. And we are including some of the what's allowed in the new SBA rules that weren't allowed even a few months ago. Then it moves on to purchase price. And the purchase price, I like to break out into its components, right? You want to make sure that the purchase price is very clear. This is the first thing the seller is going to look at. So make it very clear what the total is, what is cash at close, what is deferred. And if there's real estate, break that out separately also. Because if you make this part confusing, then the seller may not even read the rest of it. But you also want to make clear, right? You've got a footnote about seller notes and what to include around seller notes. And as you can see down here, it can end up being a pretty long paragraph around the seller note. It doesn't have to be, but some of them will end up being that way. And then here's something that I like, but not everyone does this, but I like it. And that is to put a metric and a multiple in the LOI, right? I find that makes things much easier after QOE if the numbers come in softer than were initially reported.
James David, sorry, was that a multiple to the exclusion of an actual purchase price? No, they're both.
We put a number and we put a multiple, right? So the number is, $2 million, assuming the business has achieved, $500,000 of EBITDA over the trailing 12 months or in 2024 or whatever, right? Which would make for a 4x multiple, and we would put all of that. Now, those numbers don't have to be, but I like to put that because if you put the multiple and the metric, it makes it easier to have the conversation later. but definitely include the headline purchase price, because again, that's the first thing the seller will look at.
And having a multiple only is doesn't, somebody's asking, you would not have a multiple only. There's got to be an absolute dollar amount.
You want a number, yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have, I'm not going to go over it here, but we will put normalized level of working capital. I know working capital is the bugaboo in this space, and everybody has different opinions. And as you can see, there are 5 different footnotes about it. So there's quite a bit more commentary there, but I'm going to skip over that because, well, it's my presentation, so I can. Then we will, then you move through some of these other sections: definitive agreement, business operations, closing, right? All of that, that's pretty much boilerplate. But again, some people put a closing date, a target closing date, in an LOI. I think you can, but I think anybody who does this knows, right? The lenders will drive the timeline often. So, and then we get into closing conditions. All right, these, again, this is not none of this part isn't one of the binding parts. But if there are key employees that you're going to want to sign contracts with, or if there's certain contracts that are going to have to get assigned or whatever, right? It's good to flag those things in the LOI, which is what that footnote is about. Same thing with transition services. Like, let's include it if we can. I'd like to see numbers here for an amount of time or a number of hours, etc. But you may not know. It's also here big if there's going to be additional compensation or not, right? That's important, because sometimes that can be a lever that you can use with sellers to have a paid consulting agreement post closing. That's more tax efficient for you, frankly, as the buyer. So sometimes that's a way to bridge a valuation gap. Even due diligence is boilerplate, exclusivity, whatever. It's a formula. Governing law, just pick the state where you are usually.
Or where the target is.
Or where the target is. Again, don't get hung up over stuff like that. Confidentiality. If there is an NDA, right, have it continue in effect. And then,
James David, those footnotes, sorry, the green
so the green
is linked down to the footnotes.
The green is just to make sure you see the footnotes,
Mm-hmm.
Because some people may not be used to them. They don't link, but like, here's number 16 and here's 16. So the green is just to make sure that you see it as you're using the document.
And the little bubble that comes up with text is verbatim the same text as what's at the bottom of the document.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
And those stay in, all that footnote stays. Those are annotations for our benefit, or no, those stay in for in the final document for the seller.
All the footnotes are annotations for you as the searcher or sponsor who will be using this. They will all be deleted before you send it.
Okay. Sorry if you already said that. Yeah.
Yeah. So like number 14, which is about the state for the governing law, right? Here's the note. It'll be Delaware, the state where the business is located.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So
obviously, that's not.
You'll implement that instruction, and then you would just delete the footnote, and then it's gone, right?
Oh, nice. Okay. No, for those of us non-attorneys, guys, who've never used the footnote feature in our lives in Word, learning how it works here on the go.
Yeah. Yeah. So what you'll do is, you'll implement it, and then you'll just delete it.
Okay. Great.
Don't be scared of that, hopefully. And then you'll just roll down to the signatures. I will note, and there is a footnote about this. All right, go ahead and sign it before you send it. Just as a matter of course, go ahead and sign the LOI. That way, if the seller wants to, they can just sign it and send it back to you. That never happens, or very rarely happens, that the seller would just sign it before negotiating it more, but give them the chance to do so. so that's sort of the quick run through. Again, I tried to make it to where people weren't scrambling to read it all. You'll be able to read it all later. And a few of the places, or a few of the footnotes are quite a bit longer, and they're sort of permutations, right? Here's 3 options, and if this, then make these changes. If this, then make these changes.
Great.
We try to make it simple to use, but again, we are attorneys, so there are limits to our ability to do that.
One other thing.
Well,
Oh,
no, please, Bill.
I was just gonna say, one other thing I'll just note on the LOI is that a lot of templates out there are a little bit on the longer side. Once you go through ours and take out all the footnotes and everything, it ends up being, around 2 pages. We tend to like it to be on the simpler side. And I'll also say, especially for smaller deals, sometimes smaller works better, because you'll see some sellers that have just, been working in their business for 30 years, and they might get a little bit of an allergic reaction to be given, a 5-page LOI, with like a bunch of dense text. So, feel out what feels right for your seller and make sure you're not overwhelming them, because that's, it's nice to get clarity on a lot of things, but it's also, in general, for the buyer, it's okay to have a simpler LOI at the LOI signing stage. So.
I'm not sure if it's 2 pages. I think it's 3 or 4, but regardless. But what you want, the goal of an LOI, I mean, take a step back and think more strategically about the whole process, right? The goal of the LOI is, once it's signed, for you and the seller to have an agreement in place on the structure that's going to get you to closing, right? Some of the specific terms may change. Some of the specific terms you won't know yet, but you want to have the structure in place. So, you need to, if networking capital is a thing, right? The seller needs to know that. You need to know that. Ideally, you agree on how it's going to be calculated and handled, right? Because if you don't agree, that can blow up your deal later.
The last thing you want is to pay all this money to go through QOV and then realize that you actually don't have a deal with the seller on the other end. And the LOI is there to prevent that.
Yeah. And it can be the same thing with payment terms on the seller note. I've seen that cause huge problems because it wasn't clear. I've seen it be a real problem for buyers if they didn't demarcate what's cash at close and what's deferred. Right? I've seen that be a real issue a few times. So the purpose of the LOI, again, to try to get clear on the framework of the deal, right? Ideally, I can take your signed LOI and more or less draft the purchase agreement. And then we have a conversation to fill in some placeholder numbers, right? That's not, it doesn't work perfectly like that, but try to think of it that way. And we talk to a lot of searchers who don't want to have certain conversations with the seller, especially around working capital. Have that conversation now, because if you have it later, you may find out that you've burned through tens of thousands of dollars when you never had a deal to begin with, right? So, and I know how hard it is to get a business under LOI, but at the same time, you kind of want to break the deal now rather than later, right? If it's gonna break, it's better to break it early. So, having a little bit more detail in the LOI and laying out these concepts is a way to make sure that everybody agrees on how it's going to work. Because if you don't, your chance of actually closing, and remember, that is the ultimate goal here, right? The goal is to close, not to get a bunch of things under LOI, right? Your goal is to close, and you want to do what you can to increase those odds. And the way to do that is to make sure that the big issues are covered in the LOI. Right? Another reason we like to talk to people in the LOI process.
There's a philosophy that says just send the damn LOI. that many searchers, kind of like you guys were talking about, how some searchers will spin their wheels thinking about the entity. Some will overthink the LOI, and just it's such a big step in the life cycle of a search that many searchers just have a hard time taking the step, and so err on the side of action and send the damn LOI versus not. But it sounds like you guys actually don't subscribe to that, on the heels of what you just said there, James David, that really this should be a document that's pretty well thought through.
So I'm going to equivocate on you a little bit, because I had this send the damn LOI conversation twice yesterday, actually, with different
Oh,
people.
you were saying to them, send the damn LOI?
Yeah, to two different people. I don't think there is a universal answer here, right? It does depend on psychology, right? Because if you're a searcher and you just pepper brokers with LOIs that are just garbage, then you can find yourself blacklisted, right? That does happen. But if you have been searching and searching for months and you've never sent one, send the damn LOI, right? So you have to kind of evaluate your own personality type, and are you that paralysis by analysis, or are you just aim, shoot, fire, right? Just bam, bam, bam. And it may be that you need to pull back a little bit. It may be that you need to be pushed, right? And that's why we will talk to searchers before they send that first LOI, is to help get them comfortable. Because as long as you're not one of those two extremes, it's going to be okay, and just send them. But if you need that little push, then I'm happy to do that. I'm not a great therapist, but I can give people a kick up the backside when necessary.
Another thing I'll say on that point is, if you should send an LOI if everything checked out with the seller and you did a deal on the terms of the LOI, you would be willing to do that deal, right? So where you can get in trouble, if you send out an LOI and the seller says yes, and then the seller is, perfectly fine with the financials and other stuff, and then you don't do the deal or you back out, that is really, really bad, right? Because then you've just wasted the seller's time, you've wasted your time and money. Don't do that. But if you're in a situation, you can ask yourself this question: if everything checked out, would I be willing to do the deal on these terms? And if the answer is yes, there's no reason why you shouldn't send out the LOI. And it's okay not to know. It's okay to be like, well, finances might be messy, other stuff. That's totally fine. Otherwise, non-binding. You can back out if operational diligence or other diligence comes back and it's not the business you thought. But like, as long as you're at that point, you should, where you would be comfortable doing the deal on those terms, if everything checked out, there's no reason not to send it.
And you're never going to have all the information you want before you send the LOI.
Right.
So just, if you can get comfortable enough, send it.
Yeah.
And
If you assume everything that you have to assume is actually good, and you're still willing to do the deal on those terms, do it.
And understand that you're probably going to have to send several, right?
Yeah.
It is a volume thing, right? I mean, I know people who have only sent one and closed on that one, but I know people who have sent dozens and they're still searching. So,
guys, say more. We've got a lot of questions about binding, non-binding. The LOI, classically, you just said it, Bill, is non-binding. So you're not committing, absolutely. But just say a little bit more there. Is there anything binding to it? Is everything actually just non-binding? Say more, please.
The things that are binding are the exclusivity and confidentiality provisions. So when you do have an LOI in place, the seller can't be soliciting other buyers for a period of time. That's called the exclusivity period. That is binding. And then confidentiality provisions, right, of what gets shared can't be used for other things, similar to an NDA. Everything else is non-binding But the seller is going to look at the purchase price, right? You're going to look at that headline purchase price first. And there's and then they'll look at cash at close and look at a few other things. And even though it's non-binding, right, people anchor, right? There is a psychological phenomenon of anchoring. And so think of it, even though these terms are non-binding, think of each of these terms, especially the ones with numbers, as dropping an anchor. And then for the final deal terms to be different than what's in the LOI, there has to be a reason for that change. And that's, in many ways, that's what diligence is for. But that is precisely why I like to put financial metric and a multiple with the purchase price, because that lays the groundwork for you as the buyer to have that conversation with the seller if the financials come back softer than were reported. It's a much easier conversation to say, hey, I made an offer of this multiple, right? And it turned out that your numbers they weren't there. So I'm going to drop the purchase price, right? Because that way you're not being, the seller's not going to be happy, but you can at least say, hey, I wasn't lying to you, right? My offer was this multiple of a number that you gave me, right? Because you're going to use the numbers that the seller gives for that calculation. Like it turned out that like what you said, seller, was incorrect, so we're going to adjust, right? And that's just a much easier conversation to have. Not that I've seen deals blow up over that, but I definitely have. So,
What is market for the exclusivity period?
For SBA deals, self-funded, market is 60 days. Often you'll lead with 90 and they'll trade back. 30 days is too quick. You're not going to be able to get through SBA underwriting in that time.
So start with 90, they'll push back, be happy or be content arriving at 60.
Yeah.
And the reality is, if you're making meaningful progress towards a closing, that's not going to be, if you do need to extend that on the back end, it's not going to be an issue. If it is going to be an issue, then you probably weren't closing anyway. So
independent sponsor and traditional search are longer. I would do 90 for those because you have to arrange debt financing and equity financing. It takes longer. So
number of questions, the same question to you guys. Can we use your LOI template even if we're not your client? Or is there some sort of commitment if I want to use this LOI to become your client?
I would love it if we put a little block text at the end. You are now. You have to use it.
No, once it's in the wild, it's in the wild, right? We understand that it will be used by people who are not our clients. And we make it clear in this document that you're not our client until you sign up with us. But we are releasing this, to help everyone, but also it is meant to drive leads for us to generate clients. So, but we understand that people will do what they'll do.
Yep. I earlier insulted brokers by saying how the NDAs that they get are so often, PDFs that you have to go into and sign. And the reality is a lot of people, even many people much more sophisticated than brokers are sending around documents to be signed that way. Should searchers here, as a best practice, stick their LOI into DocuSign or a DocuSign equivalent and do it that way? This is a very tactical question.
Yeah, I mean,
and why don't these tools have more traction? Why isn't everybody just putting everything into a DocuSign and just taking away the pain of us having to try to sign a PDF?
I'm not going to answer the second question because I don't have a good answer. I know why certain big law firms don't do it that way, but as for this world, I think people just have their systems and they stay with their systems. As to whether you should or not, I lean towards making it easy, right? You want to make it easy for the seller always, as easy as possible. But when you're at the LOI stage, right, the broker is playing gatekeeper. So if the broker wants it wants you to use a certain process, do that of submitting it, right? And you're probably going to have to submit it to the broker anyway, right?
Yeah.
So,
And something else you should just be careful of is if you're not sure they're going to accept yours, if you're just submitting one of like several, if you submit it with on DocuSign or some other system and you're not sure if it's there yet, that can be a little bit of an aggressive tactic because, the seller might accidentally, hit the button and then be like, oh my gosh, what did I do? And so just be careful not to be presumptive, I would say.
and it's unlikely that you're going to have the seller's email anyway. So,
Yeah. But if that ends up happening,
but
just
if that is the case, yeah, if I receive a document that I have never seen before and I receive it in DocuSign, that does not make me happy. So,
Oh, well, that's a really important little detail there. When you're sending a document for first time being reviewed, just send it as a straight document, and maybe only later, once you've negotiated it, say, okay, now do we agree on everything? If so, I'm going to send you a DocuSign to sign it, sort of thing. Does that sound?
yeah. Exactly.
Great. Couple of questions about you guys. Is there so you kind of, or you did say that you like to engage with searchers ideally before they send the LOI, just in case. Is there a pre-LOI consultation cost if a searcher wants you to review the template before they review their LOI before they send it?
yeah, so usually not, and I'll regret that. I'm sure I'll regret that. But often we'll take a quick look at it and have a short conversation with you just as part of our business development operations. Sort of just a normal intake call. I'll say that for those who are worried about it, we also our current iteration of our pricing or our workflow for self-funded searchers and sponsors too, and again subject to change. I think we changed this model twice last year, but currently for sort of the base model, we operate in 3 milestones for searchers. So the first is when we start, which is meant to get you through the LOI process and that early legal diligence. The second tranche is when you, after QOE, and you as the searcher or sponsor give us the green light and say go, deal's on, and then we draft the documents. And then the third tranche is at close. And the way the fee ultimately gets structured is there's different amounts at each stage. And given what we know about deal dynamics and the way things break down, our fees are backloaded, right? So if it does happen that you work with us on an LOI, you get one under LOI, it breaks at QOE, right? The deal falls apart, you're not going to be out that much. And we're happy to, keep working with you in the future. So we do everything we can to try to structure our engagements to be as aligned with searcher goals and needs as possible.
Great.
But to answer the short question, yeah, I'll talk to you. Pre-LOI.
Another question about will they get the template? Yes, yes, this LOI template will be sent out in the email. So watch your inboxes. I will say that this is not the template is not just on the Barlow and Williams website for you to download. There will be a landing page where you can request it by entering in your information. So, sorry, let me be clear. It will be available from Barlow and Williams again via the website on the other side of filling out a form. But just to get your hands on it as quickly as possible, the way to do that will be to watch your inbox, where we will send it as an attachment. It's just a Word doc that we're going to attach to the email that goes out with a link to this recording. So that's how best way for you to get it, or the fastest. So we're at the hour, guys. Maybe just a couple more, if I could. Earnest money provisions. What do you see? What do you see in the market there?
Well, you'll notice that there isn't anything about earnest money in our template when you receive it. So that should be your lead provision, or your lead is that you should not include it at all. Now, Bill, go ahead and talk about the permutation.
So yeah, this will happen. This is something that a broker will request. Obviously, you should fight it. You should definitely fight it if it's non-refundable. The issue is that most of the time, if you're not doing the deal, it's because there's something wrong with the seller's business, right? So why are you going out of pocket in addition to your QOV costs for, paying a breakup fee, etc. Now, putting money in earnest, if it's truly in earnest and it's completely non-refundable, or it's completely refundable, we've had deals where people have done it. Again, we don't love it because anytime money goes out of your account, it can become difficult to get back. But that's a lot more, that's more amenable. I will say also, one of the reasons brokers will sometimes request this is because they want to know that you're serious, right? And so we find that there are sometimes alternative ways to do that. For instance, when you show them, that you have letters from a bank, that you're, pre-qualified, whatever it is, and just spending time with them, they will often get to the point where they're like, oh, well, this is a real person. They're serious. They might waive the requirement.
Great. Thank you. We'll do two more questions, one very specific and one a little broader. When we talked about the exclusivity a minute ago, we talked about your answer was related to the seller, that the seller can't have the business on the market. They're exclusively working with you for the exclusivity period. Is there an exclusivity requirement of the searchers and buyers, so they can have multiple LOIs out, be having multiple conversations in parallel?
Yeah, it's, that can get expensive and confusing and administratively awful, but yes, you can have multiple LOIs out. I don't know that I advise having multiple signed LOIs at one time, but yes, there is no limit on you as the buyer as far as exclusivity goes.
Great. And then on the topic of retrading, which of course is negotiating later, closer to close, some of the terms of the offer of the LOI. There were a number of questions, so let me try to distill them. First of all, it has a negative connotation, the word retrade. But it would seem that it's almost some like your hypothetical bill, that like you put an LOI out, and if everything checks out, you should be comfortable moving forward with that transaction, which is a good thought exercise. But I think you also were like, kind of held it up as like a this never happens actually sort of thing. So in some sense, there's always some renegotiation, right? And so I guess the question would be, why, for first-time buyers, should they feel like they're being jerks if they want to renegotiate or retrade something? Point one, point two, where are common areas of where do you see that things are often retraded? What elements?
Yeah, so don't feel like a jerk if you need to retrade, right? It happens in almost every deal. It is right, and that fact that it happens all the time is yet another reason why you need to build a strong relationship with your seller, because it's easier to have those conversations if there is a high level of trust. If there's a lower level of trust between buyer and seller, then a retrade is more likely to result in a deal collapsing. So yet another strategic reason, in addition to the ample reasons of post-closing reality, but even in the deal itself, right? It is very useful to build trust with your seller in case a retrade is needed. Bill, talk about what gets retraded most.
Yeah, so I would say in terms of retrades, top of the list is working capital. That often gets done. Also top of the list is price. It's very common for EBITDA to slip by 10% in the, quality of earnings report. Price is always the most difficult because obviously you're decreasing it. With working capital, it's sort of money in my pocket, money in your pocket. It's also a situation where less sophisticated sellers will intuitively think that they get to keep all of their accounts receivable and everything else because it's theirs. And that's not the reality of how a lot of businesses, are bought and sold. So it takes a little education, and a seller can get their backup unless you've established that trust relationship if they haven't been educated about it. There are other things which can be negotiated, like non-competes, is a pretty standard one. What are the carve-outs for it? Those sorts of things. And there's a long list. A lot of things can get negotiated, but I'd say those are kind of some of the biggest ones.
Fantastic, guys. Where are you located? Somebody's asking.
We
in
are
Durham, North Carolina.
Yeah, Durham, North Carolina, but we work with clients all over the country and frankly, all over the world. So
So it really doesn't matter that you're where you are.
And we help on transactions in all 50 states. So
fantastic. Audience, so we're wrapping up here. See the comment that I dropped in there at the top. Somebody was talking about copying and pasting it being difficult. You got to hover over the right side of the comment, and there's a little ellipse, and you click that and click and hit copy. I hope that is clear. Otherwise, just click all of those links really quick to get them open in your browser tabs. And do connect with James, David, and Bill. Their LinkedIn. I'm just going to dump those back in real quick. Hold on, everybody. Well, no, I'm not. I don't want to make 250 people wait. You can find them easy enough on LinkedIn. So email will go out in the next 48 hours. It will include a recording. It will include as an attachment. So check your spam, I guess, the Word doc version of the template that you saw today. And Barlow and Williams is the name of the firm. Reach out to them. And we're doing our next office hours with James, David, and Bill in just 2 weeks. So we will keep your eyes peeled for that. Do we want to tease what the topic is? Let's do, actually.
Sure.
What is it,
So
Bill?
some of you might have heard that there have been some changes on what you can and can't do under the SBA rules. So we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about financing, sort of common things that people do that are things that people should know about the financing side. And we're going to do that both for SBA deals and also for non-SBA deals. Basically the 80-20 of what you should know. And included in that, we're going to talk about the new structures that have just become available because of the changes that were made just 2 months ago.
Fantastic. So that'll be in a couple of weeks, everybody. Keep your eyes peeled. We'll get a registration link for that on the Acquiring Minds website here in the next 24 hours. Anything else, guys?
Good to go.
Great work. Great work as always, James, David, and Bill. Thank you so much for doing these. These are wonderfully helpful. We had a huge crowd today. Tons of questions. We have over 100 questions, 130 questions. So we got to but a few of them. Sorry, audience. There's just a lot of demands on these guys' time. But thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Bill and James, David. See you in 2 weeks. This ends the webinar.